Let's begin with something deceptively small, something so common in Christian culture that we rarely question it. Complaining, now I don't mean the occasional expression of grief or the honest cry of lament. Scripture is full of lament. The Psalms are full of raw emotional honesty before God. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the low, repetitive hum of dissatisfaction that becomes the background music of a believer's life. Complaining is not merely expressing discomfort. It is rehearsing distrust. And that distinction matters because psychologically speaking, what you rehearse, you reinforce. Neural pathways are strengthened by repetition. If you consistently narrate your life through the lens of frustration, injustice, or disappointment, your brain becomes efficient at detecting more of it. You become skilled at finding what's wrong. And eventually you cannot see what's right, even if it's standing directly in front of you. Spiritually, the mechanism is even more serious. Complaining shifts your focus from God's sovereignty to your circumstances. It subtly communicates, God, I don't like how you're running this. It may not be that explicit, but that is the underlying posture. It is a protest against reality. And if you believe God is sovereign, then it is a protest against His providence. Now, think about what that does to faith. Faith requires trust in what you cannot see. Complaining anchors you to what you can see, and what you see is usually incomplete. Your perception of the present moment is microscopic compared to God's panoramic view of eternity. Yet when you complain, you elevate your fragment of perspective above His infinite understanding. That is not a small psychological adjustment. That is a fundamental spiritual realignment in the wrong direction. There's also something corrosive about the tone of complaint. It spreads. Negativity is socially contagious. One murmuring voice can infect an entire community. We see this pattern historically, repeatedly. People begin by voicing reasonable concerns. Those concerns morph into grievances. Grievances become identity, and identity becomes rebellion. What begins as I don't like this situation evolves into I don't like this situation, evolves into I don't trust the one who placed me here. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The enemy doesn't need you to renounce your faith publicly. He simply needs you to renounce your faith publicly. He simply needs you to narrate your life as if God is unreliable. If he can get you to sing that song long enough, your emotional life will align with it. Your prayer life will shrink. Gratitude will feel artificial. Worship will feel hollow. And eventually you will interpret every delay, every hardship, every unanswered prayer as evidence that you were right to doubt in the first place. Complaining reshapes perception. Perception shapes belief. Belief shapes behavior. And behavior determines destiny. You see, gratitude and complaint cannot occupy the same psychological space. They are mutually exclusive interpretive frameworks. Gratitude says, even here, God is working. Complaint says, this should not be happening. Gratitude recognizes complexity. Complaint simplifies reality into blame. But here's the deeper philosophical issue. Complaining presumes you know what a better world would look like. That's a remarkable assumption. You are finite. Your knowledge is limited. Your timeline is microscopic. Yet when you complain in a persistent, habitual way, you are implicitly claiming that if you were in control, things would be arranged more appropriately. That is not humility. And Christianity at its core is built on humility before divine wisdom. Now, this does not mean passivity. It does not mean refusing to confront injustice or improve circumstances. There's a difference between constructive action and corrosive murmuring. One is grounded in responsibility. The other is grounded in responsibility. The other is grounded in resentment. Resentment is particularly dangerous because it feels justified. It feels morally righteous, but resentment slowly transforms you into someone who cannot experience joy without suspicion. It narrows your vision. It makes you brittle. And spiritually, it creates distance between you and God. Why? Because intimacy requires trust. If your default narrative is that God is withholding, mismanaging, or neglecting you, then prayer becomes negotiation. Instead of communion, worship becomes obligation instead of overflow. Now consider the alternative when you discipline yourself to resist complaint. not by suppressing emotion, but by reframing perspective. Something shifts internally. You begin asking different questions. Instead of why is this happening to me, you ask, what is this forming in me? Instead of why is this forming in me? Instead of why isn't God fixed this? You ask, what is he teaching me here? That shift restores agency. It restores dignity. It restores faith. And paradoxically, it restores faith. And paradoxically, it restores joy. Not because circumstances changed, but because your orientation toward them did. The enemy delights in complaint because it erodes faith. Quietly, it doesn't require dramatic rebellion. It simply requires repetition. A daily whisper of dissatisfaction. A daily whisper of dissatisfaction. A constant rehearsal of what's lacking. Over time, that whisper becomes the soundtrack of your spiritual life. So the question is not whether you ever feel frustrated. You will. The question is, what narrative are you reinforcing tight? Are you strengthening trust? Or are you strengthening suspicion? Or because every word you repeat is shaping who you become? And here is the sobering reality. If you consistently narrate your life as though God is unfaithful, your heart will eventually believe it. But if you choose deliberately to anchor your speech in trust, even when emotion lags behind, you create space for faith to grow. And that choice, repeated daily, transforms you. The song of complaining may feel natural. And if you want a different life, you must choose a different song. Now closely related to complaint, but even more paralyzing, is fear. Fear is not merely an emotion. It is a lens. And whatever you look at through that lens becomes distorted. Biologically, fear is a survival mechanism. It sharpens your senses. It prepares you for threat. In the right context, it is protective. But spiritually and psychologically, when fear becomes habitual, when it becomes the dominant interpretive framework of your life, it does something far more destructive. It rearranges your hierarchy of trust, because fear, at its core, is the anticipation of loss, loss of safety, loss of control, loss of approval, loss of security, loss of the future you imagined. It doesn't just make you cautious, it makes you small. Now here's the crucial point. Fear exaggerates the problem and minimizes God simultaneously. It magnifies the storm and shrinks the sovereignty behind it. And when that happens, the storm and shrinks the sovereignty behind it. And when that happens repeatedly, the believer begins to sing a subtle but dangerous refrain. This is bigger than God can handle. No one says it that bluntly, but psychologically, that's what fear communicates. Think about how fear works cognitively. Your mind begins to simulate worst-case scenarios. Worst-case scenarios. It plays them on a loop. The brain doesn't clearly distinguish between vividly imagined threats and real ones. So your body responds. Heart rate rises, muscles tense, cortisol increases. The threat feels real. And the more you rehearse it, the more plausible it becomes. Now imagine that process applied to your faith life. You begin to imagine failure, rejection, financial collapse, illness, abandonment. You mentally inhabit those futures. And instead of bringing those fears into the presence of God, you analyze them in isolation. You become both the prosecutor and the defendant in your own mental courtroom. And the verdict is almost always the same. You are not safe. Fear narrows your perception. It pushes out possibility. It pushes out hope. It pushes out trust. And here's the theological implication. Faith requires an orientation toward promise. Fear requires an orientation toward catastrophe. They cannot both dominate your consciousness at the same time. You will serve one narrative. If fear is your dominant narrative, obedience becomes almost impossible. Why? Because obedience often requires stepping into uncertainty. It requires action without full visibility. But fear demands guarantees. It demands certainty. And when it doesn't get certainty, it defaults to paralysis. So what happens? You delay. You hesitate. You rationalize. You wait for C. Auditions to become ideal, which they rarely do. And from the outside, it doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like caution. It looks reasonable. but internally something is happening. Your trust in God's promises is being quietly replaced with trust in your ability to control outcomes. That is not faith. And fear is remarkably persuasive because it disguises itself as wisdom. It says, you're just being realistic. It says, prepare for the worst. It says, don't be naive. But realism without faith becomes cynicism. Preparation without trust becomes anxiety. And anxiety, prolonged, reshapes personality. You become defensive. You avoid risk. You interpret neutral events as threats. Relationships suffer because you anticipate betrayal. Opportunities are missed because you anticipate failure. Spiritually, the cost is even higher. Prayer becomes transactional. God, make this safe. Worship becomes conditional. I will trust you when I see results. The future becomes something to dread rather than something to steward. Now consider something deeper. Fear often reveals what you worship. If you are terrified of losing reputation, perhaps reputation has become an idol. If you are terrified of financial instability, perhaps security has taken God's place. If you are terrified of rejection, perhaps approval has become your functional savior. Fear exposes attachment, and that exposure can be uncomfortable, but it is diagnostic. It tells you where your ultimate trust truly lies. This is why the enemy loves the song of fear. He doesn't need to destroy you outright. He only needs to keep you preoccupied with imagined disasters. If he can keep your attention fixated on what might go wrong, he prevents you from investing fully in what could go right under God's guidance. Fear drains initiative. It drains creativity. It drains creativity. It drains courage. And Christianity, at its best, is a courageous faith. It is not reckless, but it is bold. It moves toward calling despite uncertainty. It acts despite incomplete information. It trusts despite vulnerability. Fear says, wait until you feel safe. Faith says, move because you are secure. Those are fundamentally different orientations. Security rooted in circumstances will always fluctuate. Security rooted in divine character remains stable even when circumstances collapse. Now, this does not mean you will never feel afraid. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move in the right direction despite it. And that decision is not emotional. It is volitional. It is a commitment of the will aligned with belief. You cannot control the first spark of fear, but you can control what you do with it. Do you rehearse it? Do you magnify it? Do you allow it to narrate your future? Or do you confront it with truth? Because the moment you challenge fear with the character of God, with His faithfulness, His past provision, His sovereignty, you disrupt its authority. Fear thrives in isolation. It weakens under examination. And if you consistently interrupt fearful narratives with trust-based ones, your mind changes, your posture changes, your decisions change. You begin to act like someone who believes that God is actually in control. And here is the essential question: are you living as though the worst-case scenario is ultimate reality, or as though God's promises? Because whichever one you rehearse most often will determine the direction of your life. Fear may feel protective, but if you let it sing long enough, it will cage you. And a faith that never steps forward is a faith that never grows. So choose carefully which voice you amplify, because the song you repeat will decide the life you live. There is another song that sounds softer than fear and less aggressive than complaint, but it may be even more corrosive over time. It's the song of self-pity. Self-pity is subtle. It rarely announces itself as rebellion. It feels vulnerable. It feels honest. It even feels justified. And that's precisely why it's so dangerous. Self-pity begins with a question. Why is this happening to me? Now, on the surface, that seems reasonable. It's a natural human response to suffering. But when that question becomes a repeated refrain, it shifts from inquiry to identity. It becomes less about understanding suffering and more about centering yourself in it. Psychologically, self-pity narrows your frame of reference. You begin to interpret events primarily in terms of how they disadvantage you. Other people's struggles fade into the background. Complexity disappears. The world becomes organized around your wound. And here's what's critical. Attention magnifies experience. Whatever you focus on expands in subjective significance. If you continually focus on your injuries, emotional, relational, financial, spiritual, they grow in psychological weight. They begin to define you. Over time, the narrative changes from "I experienced pain" to "I am the one who was wronged." That's a transformation of identity. Identity is powerful because it shapes behavior. If you see yourself primarily as a victim, you will interpret ambiguity as threat. Neutral interactions become slights. Constructive criticism becomes persecution. Opportunities feel suspicious, and responsibility feels unfair. Now, we need to be very careful here. Real injustice exists. Real betrayal exists. Real betrayal exists. Real trauma exists. Acknowledging that is not weakness, it's honesty. But self-pity is not the same as honest grief. Grief moves through pain. Self-pity camps in it. Grief says, "This hurt." Self-pity says, "This defines me." And once something defines you, it dictates your trajectory. Tori, where there is something psychologically seductive about self-pity because it relieves you of agency. If you are perpetually wrong, then you are perpetually absolved of responsibility. If your life is primarily the result of what others have done to you, then your future depends on them changing, not you growing. That is profoundly disempowering spiritually. It's equally damaging. Because Christianity at its core is built on transformation. It proclaims that no matter what has happened to you, you are not reducible to it. You are not your failure. You are not your trauma. You are not your trauma. You are not your rejection. Your identity is rooted in something deeper and more stable than circumstance. But self-pity resists that redefinition. It clings to the old story because the old story is familiar. Pain becomes predictable, and predictability feels safer than uncertainty, even if that uncertainty holds growth. Here's another dimension. Self-pity isolates. When you consistently frame yourself as uniquely burdened, uniquely misunderstood, uniquely afflicted, you separate yourself from community. You may still be physically present, but emotionally you are distant. You assume others cannot understand you, and that assumption prevents genuine connection. Resentment quietly follows, and resentment, left unchallenged, hardens into bitterness. The enemy delights in this progression because it requires no dramatic moral collapse. It only requires a shift in narrative. If he can persuade you to view yourself primarily through the lens of injury rather than calling, he can keep you small. He can keep you reactive instead of proactive. And this is where the philosophical depth emerges. Human beings need meaning to endure suffering. Without meaning, suffering becomes unbearable. But self-pity strips suffering of transcendent meaning. It reduces it to randomness or cruelty. It says, his is pointless, and it's unfair. Now life is often unfair. Now life is often unfair. But meaning is not discovered in fairness. It is discovered in responsibility. The question that transforms suffering is not why me, but what can this produce in me? That question reintroduces agency. It doesn't deny pain. It reframes it. It assumes that even in adversity, there is potential for growth, strength, compassion, wisdom, resilience. It assumes that your story is not over. Self-pity says the story is over. It says, this is where I am stuck. Faith says, this is where I am being shaped. That difference is monumental. When you adopt the identity of a victim, you shrink your future to match your wound. When you adopt the identity of someone being formed, you expand your future beyond it. And here's something deeply practical. People are drawn to those who take responsibility for their growth. They trust them. They follow them. But people instinctively distance themselves from chronic self-pity because it demands constant emotional reinforcement without offering forward movement. You cannot build strong relationships on the foundation of perpetual victimhood, nor can you build a vibrant spiritual life on it. Because self-pity subtly questions God's goodness. It implies neglect. It implies partiality. It implies partiality. It implies abandonment. And if those implications go unchecked, they erode trust just as effectively as fear does. So what is the alternative? It is not denial. It is not pretending you were never hurt. It is not minimizing injustice. It is choosing to anchor your identity in something higher than your pain. It is choosing to say, this happened, but it does not own me. It is choosing to ask, how can I grow through this? Rather than, how can I be validated in this? That shift restores dignity. It restores strength. It restores direction. And perhaps most importantly, it restores hope. Because if you are not defined by what harmed you, then you are free to become something greater than it. The song of self-pity may feel comforting in the moment, but if you sing it long enough, it will confine you to a life smaller than the one you were created for. So ask yourself, are you rehearsing your wounds, or are you building your future? Because the story you tell about your suffering will determine the person you become. Because the story you tell about your suffering will determine the person you become. There is another song that is heavier than complaint, more entrenched than fear, and more calcified than self-pity. It does not usually begin loudly. It develops slowly, almost imperceptibly, over time. It is the song of bitterness. Bitterness is what happens when pain is preserved instead of processed. Now think about that carefully. Pain is inevitable. Betrayal, misunderstanding, injustice. These are universal human experiences. But bitterness is not inevitable. Bitterness is what results when pain is rehearsed without resolution. It is the decision, often unconscious, to keep the wound open. Psychologically, bitterness is frozen anger. It is anger that has lost its urgency, but not its intensity. It settles into the personality. It becomes part of how you interpret the world. And once it does, it alters perception. When you are bitter, you do not merely remember what happened. You relive it. The emotional charge remains fresh, even if the event occurred years ago. Neurologically, the brain can re-experience resentment with almost the same intensity as the original offense. The story is replayed, the dialogue is reconstructed, and each rehearsal strengthens the emotional imprint. But here is the problem. When you continually replay the offense, you keep yourself psychologically tethered to the offender. That is a profound paradox. Bitterness feels like resistance, but it is actually attachment. You are still boo, and to the person or situation you claim to despise. Your emotional energy is still oriented toward them. They occupy space in your mind, often far more space than they deserve. And spiritually, this has consequences. Because resentment reshapes the heart. It narrows it. It makes compassion difficult. It makes empathy conditional. It makes forgiveness seem naive. Over time, bitterness hardens your internal world. You become less flexible, less open, less joyful. You may still function, you may still achieve, but something inside you has contracted. Now consider what forgiveness actually is and what it is not excusing wrongdoing. It is not pretending harm did not occur. It is not inviting repeated abuse. Forgiveness is the decision to release your claim to revenge. It is the refusal to let someone else's sin dictate your spiritual state. Dictate your spiritual state. That is strength, not weakness. But bitterness whispers something different. It says, if you forgive, you are letting them win. It says, holding on to this proves you were wronged. It says your anger is justified and therefore it must be preserved. And yes, anger can be justified, but justification does not equal transformation. If anger is not transformed, it decays into resentment. And resentment left unchecked becomes identity. Now you are not merely someone who was hurt, you are someone who carries offense as a defining feature of your personality. That is a heavy burden, and the enemy understands this very well. He does not need you to collapse morally. He only needs you to become hardened, because a hardened heart is resistant to grace, both receiving it and extending it. Bitterness blocks intimacy with God in subtle ways. Prayer becomes strained because underneath your words is an unspoken grievance. Why did you allow this? Worship feels hollow because your heart is divided. You may profess trust, but internally there is an unresolved accusation. And here is the philosophical dimension. Resentment presumes moral superiority without responsibility. You position yourself as judge. You replay the offense, analyze it, and reaffirm your verdict, but you do not move toward resolution. You remain in the courtroom of your own mind, prosecuting a case that has long since passed. That posture reshakes you. It makes you vigilant for new offenses. You become hyper-aware of disrespect. You expect betrayal. You interpret ambiguity as hostility. Relationships suffer not because others are always untrustworthy, but because your lens is distorted. And bitterness rarely stays contained. It spills outward. It colors tone. It sharpens words. It cools affection. It makes reconciliation difficult, even when reconciliation is possible. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is this: bitterness robs you of peace long after the original event is over. The offender may have moved on. Circumstances may have changed. Time may have passed, but you are still carrying the weight. So the real question becomes, who is suffering now? Forgiveness, by contrast, is an act of liberation, not primarily for the other person, though it may benefit them, but for you. It is the conscious refusal to let the past dictate your present posture. It does not deny justice. It entrusts justice to a higher authority, and that requires humility. It requires trust that you are not the final arbiter of fairness. It requires faith that wrong will ultimately be addressed, even if not on your timeline. That is not easy, but it is transformative. When you release bitterness, something remarkable happens internally. Your energy returns, your emotional bandwidth expands, compassion becomes possible again. You are no longer defined by what was done to you, and spiritually your heart softens. Grace flows more freely because you recognize how much grace you have received yourself. The song of bitterness feels powerful. It feels righteous. It feels strong. But if you sing it long enough, it will calcify your soul. You cannot walk in freedom while clutching resentment. So ask yourself, what are you still carrying that is quietly carrying you? Because until you release it, you will remain bound to a past that no longer has the authority to define your future. And the chains you refuse to drop will continue to limit how far you can walk. There is another song that doesn't sound destructive at first. In fact, it sounds reasonable, mature, balanced. It's the song of compromise, not dramatic denial, not open rebellion, just subtle adjustment, a small lowering of standards here, a slight reshaping of convictions there, a quiet silence when truth becomes uncomfortable. And over time, what began as flexibility becomes conformity. Now, psychologically, this is understandable. Human beings are wired for belonging. Social acceptance is not trivial. It has survival value. It has survival value. Historically, exclusion from the tribe meant danger. So we are deeply motivated to avoid rejection. We calibrate our behavior to match the group. We soften our edges. We adjust our tone. We learn quickly what earns approval and what provokes resistance. There is nothing inherently wrong with social intelligence. But when the desire for acceptance overrides commitment to truth, something internal fractures. Compromise often begins as self-protection. You think, if I speak fully, I might lose influence. If I hold this line, I might lose opportunity. If I express this conviction clearly, I might lose relationships. So you trim your words, you dilute clarity. You maintain the appearance of belief while quietly adjusting substance. And here is the crucial danger. Identity is shaped by action. If you repeatedly act in ways that contradict your stated convictions, your internal world begins to reorganize itself. Cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable. So either behavior changes to match belief, or belief slowly changes to justify behavior. Most often, belief adjusts. That is how compromise becomes internalized. You may still use the same language. You may still attend the same gatherings. You may still identify with the same faith, but the sharpness of conviction dulls, the urgency fades, the distinctiveness disappears, and you don't notice it happening because it is gradual. Philosophically, this is the erosion of integrity. Integrity means wholeness, alignment between what you claim and how you live. When that alignment weakens, fragmentation begins. You become divided internally. Part of you knows what you believe. Another part of you negotiates against it. That division creates anxiety. You feel unstable, though you may not know why. You feel hesitant, though nothing externally catastrophic has occurred. The reason is simple. You are living in contradiction, and contradiction drains strength. Spiritually, compromise is particularly corrosive because it shifts ultimate authority. Instead of truth shaping your relationship to culture, culture begins shaping your interpretation of truth. You start asking not, is this right, but is this acceptable? And those are radically different questions. When acceptability becomes the standard, conviction becomes optional. And when conviction becomes optional, faith becomes cosmetic. The enemy does not need you to renounce your beliefs publicly. He simply needs you to make them negotiable privately. Because once your beliefs are negotiable, they no longer anchor you. They float with circumstance, they adjust with pressure. Now let's go deeper. Compromise feels safe in the short term. It reduces tension. It avoids conflict. It preserves comfort. But comfort is not the highest good. Growth rarely occurs in maximum comfort. Character is formed through tension. The tension between what is easy and what is right. If you consistently choose what is easy, your capacity for courage diminishes. Courage is a muscle. If it is not exercised, it atrophies. And without courage, you cannot stand when standing costs you something. There is also a profound psychological cost to living diluted. When you silence your convictions to gain approval, you subtly communicate to yourself that approval is more valuable than truth. That internal message reshapes your hierarchy of values. You begin to fear disapproval more than you fear dishonesty. And that is a dangerous inversion, because eventually you will face moments where silence is no longer neutral. It becomes complicity, where adjustment is no longer flexibility. It becomes surrender, and at that point, regaining clarity requires far more effort than maintaining it would have. Now, this does not mean rigidity. It does not mean harshness. It does not mean self-righteousness. Conviction without humility becomes arrogance, but humility without conviction becomes cowardice. The balance is not compromise. It is courage expressed with grace. You can speak truth without cruelty. You can hold conviction without hostility. You can remain distinct without becoming isolated. But that requires clarity about who you are and whose approval ultimately matters most. If your identity is anchored in cultural affirmation, you will always adjust to preserve it. If your identity is anchored in something transcendent, you can endure disapproval without fragmentation. And here is the paradox. People ultimately trust those who are consistent, even those who disagree with you often respect integrity, but they struggle to respect someone who shifts positions to maintain favor. Integrity builds strength internally and credibility externally. The compromise erodes both. So ask yourself, where have you quietly adjusted what you once held firmly? Where have you softened truth not out of wisdom but out of fear? Where has convenience replaced conviction? Because every small compromise is a rehearsal, and rehearsals become habits, and habits become character. The song of compromise is seductive because it promises peace without cost, but it delivers comfort at the expense of power. And a faith that never risks discomfort will never display courage. So decide now, will you be shaped by pressure or anchored by principle? Because the convictions you dilute today will determine the strength you possess tomorrow. And beneath all of these songs, complaint, fear, self-pity, bitterness, compromise, there is one that sustains them all. It is quieter, more intellectual, often dressed in sophistication. It is the song of doubt. Now we need to be precise here. Doubt in its initial form is not sin. It can be the beginning of deeper understanding. Honest questions are not threats to faith. They can refine it. But there is a difference between wrestling toward truth and drifting away from trust. The doubt we are speaking of is not the momentary question. It is the settled suspicion. It is the quiet, persistent whisper, is God really good? Is He really involved? Is He really faithful? And once those questions stop being explorations and start becoming conclusions, something shifts at the foundation of your life. Because faith is not merely intellectual agreement. It is relational trust, and trust depends on character. If you begin to question the character of God consistently, His goodness, His wisdom, His timing, then our obedience becomes conditional. You obey when it makes sense. You trust when outcomes are favorable. You worship when circumstances align. But when life becomes confusing or painful, obedience feels irrational. Worship feels hollow. Prayer feels pointless. That is the effect of sustained doubt. Psychologically, doubt functions as erosion. It rarely demolishes belief overnight. It works slowly, like water wearing down stone. A delayed answer here, an unexpected loss there, a disappointment that lingers unresolved. Each event alone may not destroy trust, but interpreted through suspicion, they accumulate. And here is where interpretation becomes decisive. Two people can experience the same hardship. One interprets it as abandonment. The other interprets it as refinement. The event is identical. The meaning assigned to it is not. Meaning shapes endurance. If suffering is meaningless, it becomes intolerable. If suffering is meaningless, it becomes intolerable. If suffering is purposeful, it becomes bearable, even transformative. Doubt strips suffering of purpose. It reframes it as evidence against divine goodness. It suggests randomness or indifference. And once that framework settles in, hope begins to thin. But notice how doubt usually enters. It does not begin with grand philosophical objections. It begins personally. Why didn't this prayer get answered? Why did this relationship fall apart? Why did this door close when I was certain it was right? Those are real questions. Why did this door close when I was certain it was right? But when they are interpreted as indictments rather than mysteries, doubt deepens. Now, philosophically, this exposes something profound about human limitation. We crave coherence. We want events to align neatly with our expectations. But we operate with partial information. Our perspective is bounded by time, emotion, and context. We see fragments. God, if He is sovereign, sees the totality. The tension arises because we assume our fragment should make complete sense to us immediately. When it doesn't, doubt offers a seductive alternative. Perhaps there is no greater coherence. Perhaps there is no greater coherence. Perhaps there is no deeper wisdom. Perhaps what appears chaotic simply is chaotic. That conclusion feels intellectually bold. It feels independent, but it often emerges not from pure logic, but from wounded expectation. And the enemy leverages that wound, because once doubt reframes God as unreliable, every future event is filtered through that suspicion. Delays become neglect. Silence becomes absence. Correction becomes rejection. And the tragedy is this. Doubt begins to rewrite your memory. You stop recalling past faithfulness. You fixate on present confusion. The narrative shifts from "He has carried me before" to "He may not carry me now." But here is the deeper issue. Doubt ultimately elevates human judgment above divine wisdom. It says, if I cannot reconcile this, it cannot be reconciled. If I do not see the purpose, there must not be one. That is an extraordinary claim for a finite mind to make. Humility acknowledges limitation. It says, I do not understand, but I do not assume there is no understanding beyond mine. That posture preserves faith even in mystery. Now, this does not eliminate emotional struggle. Faith does not mean emotional certainty. It means chosen trust in the absence of full clarity. It means anchoring yourself not in outcomes, but in character. And character is revealed over time. If you have lived long enough, you have seen moments that once felt devastating later reveal unexpected growth. You have seen closed doors redirect you to better paths. You have seen pain deepen compassion. Those memories are not accidental. They are evidence. Doubt thrives when memory is selective. So the discipline of faith involves remembering, deliberately recalling the ways you have been sustained before. It involves resisting the temptation to make permanent conclusions based on temporary confusion, because confusion is not proof of abandonment. And here is the final layer. Doubt, if left unchallenged, eventually reshapes identity. You begin to define yourself not as someone held by God, but as someone navigating alone. Responsibility becomes heavier. Anxiety increases. The future feels more uncertain because it rests entirely on your capacity. That is a crushing burden. Faith, by contrast, does not remove responsibility. It contextualizes it. It says, you are responsible, but you are not alone. The song of doubt whispers that you are kind. So ask yourself, when circumstances are unclear, what assumption do you default to? That God is negligent or that He may be working beyond your sight? Because the assumption you rehearse will determine the stability of your soul, doubt may appear intellectual, but if you let it define God's character, it will quietly dismantle your trust. And without trust, faith cannot stand. So choose carefully what you conclude in seasons of confusion, because your interpretation today will shape your endurance tomorrow.